Hi, welcome to my seminar this morning. I am Dr. Teresa Bogard, and I'm coming to you from my studio at the University of Wyoming. I just wanted to let you know that this webinar will be archived on the MTNA website where you can log in as a member and watch it at your convenience. Today, I'm going to be talking about memorization, and I will be sure to leave plenty of time at the end for a question and answer period. I've made a really detailed PowerPoint presentation to accompany my talk, and I hope that will be useful for you as well. If you have additional questions after the webinar is over, please feel free to contact me at the University of Wyoming or submit your questions online and I will answer them. So I know that playing from memory doesn't come easily for most of us. In fact, I would say it probably doesn't come easily for anybody, but nobody wants to talk about it. It's a difficult thing that we are all afraid of. So in fact, it can be so traumatic that some wonderful pianists that I know have either given up on solo playing or just left the profession entirely. One really horrendous, humiliating performance can change your life in a not good way. So for those of us with performance anxiety, the fear of playing from memory can be almost debilitating. After a disastrous lapse during my master's degree at a very prestigious music school, I decided I had to do something. The following year, I started my doctoral degree and met a piano faculty member who finally helped me start to learn how to memorize. Even though I never studied piano with her, I owe many of my thoughts about memorization to Dr. Helen Walker Hill, who's now deceased, but she was at the University of Colorado when I was there doing my doctorate. So I'm going to turn on my PowerPoint now, and it might take a second for it to appear for you, but just give me time to do that. So I tried to just put a lot of information in my PowerPoint, and for those of you that are visual learners, that should help you be able to just see as I'm speaking. So I'm just talking in memorization and from my own experience as a performer and a teacher. So there are 5 basic types of memory. Kinesthetic memory, that's your touch memory, intellectual memory, visual memory, aural memory, and emotional musical memory. And I'll talk a little bit about each of those 5 kinds of memory. So kinesthetic memory is absolutely the most important aspect of memorization. This is your memory from your fingers, and it comes almost without thought. If you've practiced a passage a lot, usually it's memorized. But if you rely on this kind of memory totally during a performance, it can be disastrous because it doesn't have any backup. Strong kinesthetic memory is only developed with a lot of practice over a serious length of time. You're not going to develop strong kinesthetic memory if you are, say, sight reading a piece and then want to memorize it the next day. Your kinesthetic memory will not be developed enough to help you. So it's super important that we develop accurate kinesthetic memory right from the start. Practice carefully with correct notes, correct rhythms, and correct fingering. Remember, kinesthetic memory is our most important memory. And if we don't have good fingering, when we get to a passage, our hands are going to be confused. We want to give them the correct, same information every time we play. It's also really important that you imprint the correct information every time. I know that when students misread and have a wrong note, they tend to play that wrong note forever. It's very hard to correct a note that's been learned incorrectly that first time. Your brain just likes to take that first information. So the next most important kind of memory is intellectual memory. Intellectual memory provides the backup support for the kinesthetic memory, which is the most important. I had a student once who was doing her master's with me, and she had nerve damage in her hands. So her kinesthetic memory was not strong because of the nerve damage, but her intellectual memory was really remarkable. And it's how she kind of got through without that primary form of memory being very strong. So with intellectual memory, you are trying to understand everything in the music so it helps your memory. So analyze and memorize the overall form of your piece. With beginning students, mark the form, talk about the form, point it out. It's really important that we teach form to students from the beginning because we need it later for memorization. So look for repetitions of material and show them to your students as well. It's amazing the things they just don't see sometimes. Then, does the section at the beginning return at the end of the piece in the same or a different key? We could have an ABA form. We could have a sonata allegro form, which is very problematic for memory because of the return of the material in a different key later. How many times have we seen students go from the exposition right into the recapitulation because they missed that key change? It's very sad, but it happens all the time. So we'll talk about that with memory as well. Then, does the opening section return more than once? Do we have some kind of a rondo form? So you're talking your students through the form and marking it in their pieces. And I start this from when they're young because I think form is so important. So then, think about harmonic structure. Know the key of the piece. It just kills me when I ask a student the key of the piece and they don't know. This is pretty urgent because if you have a memory lapse right at the end of the piece, at least you ought to be able to play a nice 5/1 cadence to finish what you're doing. So knowing the key of the piece is hugely important. Then relate the notes and the chords to their position and function within the key when possible or practical. Let's talk about practical. You can only use this kind of intellectual cueing in a way that you understand fast because you are playing. So you don't have time to be analyzing a 12-tone row while you're playing. You need to think, boom, this was a G, or simple harmonic structures that you can remember quickly and memorize quickly. So remember when you're teaching students, they will only be able to use intellectual memory if they have a basis of understanding to draw upon. So their intellectual memory will only be as good as their knowledge of theory and form. That's why it's so important to be kind of teaching those as we're going. So then, observe and identify repetitions of either short motives, longer phrases, or entire sections. Then, after you've identified them, make sure that you classify those repetitions according to what they are. So exact repetitions, these are nice for us. We can say, oh yes, I know that part, and insert it here. Part of a sequence, what is the sequence pattern? How many legs does it have? What pitch does it start on? What pitch does it end on? Does it go up by steps? Does it go up by thirds? That will help you in your memorization because it will be faster because you're memorizing a recognized pattern. Then, is it an almost exact repetition? This is harder. Some notes or rhythms have been changed or the material is presented in a new way. So let's talk about visual memory now. Visual memory includes the memory of the printed page as well as memory of the topography of a given passage on a keyboard. Visual memory of keyboard topography is very important for non-tonal contemporary music where intellectual memory may not be as useful. When memorizing something like the Schoenberg Opus 11 three pieces, really intellectual memory is not going to help you see those atonal things because you can't use it quickly enough. It's not that you can't memorize the piece and mark the rows and do all of that. It's that they are not going to help you in memory because it's too slow. So visual memory of the page is important, but it's not strong enough in anybody that I know to use it for memory. If you have a photographic memory, I'm very jealous, and you probably can play with visual memory. Aural memory, another important part of memorization, is required for inner hearing of every note before we play. It's developed slowly through practice and becomes more refined the more you practice. Aural memory is developed much more quickly in pieces that are already familiar to the student. So if they've asked you to play Feuilles for 2 years, I can guarantee you they're going to learn it faster and memorize it faster because they've been probably listening to it on YouTube. So, and for those of us that are playing ourselves, if you have to memorize a piece rapidly and learn it very quickly, listen often because it helps develop the aural memory faster. I am not somebody that listens to a lot of other performances when I'm playing a piece. I prefer to make my interpretation from the score. But if I'm in a hurry, I make sure I do extra listening to get that aural memory in my head fast. So then let's talk about audiation. It is the process of internally understanding and hearing the music you're playing. And it's a large part of aural memory. And whether we realize it or not, we are listening to our internal audiation while we play. And often we are perfect in there, and we should be, because it's what we're trying to play. So we hear everything, the nuance, the control, the rubato, the crescendos, decrescendos. Everything is in that internal audiation because it is guiding our playing. So during a memory lapse, both aural memory and kinesthetic memory are usually involved. Often a mishit will cause a memory lapse because the aural memory expectation, our internal audiation, does not match the pitch played. So this is my theory, right? I have no scientific research. I have, from memory lapses of my own and watching my students, some little thing happens and it confuses the brain, and then we have a kinesthetic memory lapse, a memory lapse from the fingers. But I think that it's often a small thing that disturbs the audiation that causes that memory lapse. So emotional musical memory. I didn't used to think about this at all, but then Frederick Chu did a presentation at the National MTNA, and I'm sure some of you heard it, talking about emotional memory. And I don't think about it in quite the same way he does, but the way I memorize, it has been very helpful to add that last component. So if you're thinking about the emotional musical memory, you want to think about all the aspects of the composition. You need to memorize the musical things like phrasing, phrase shaping, dynamic planning, rubato, all of that. And then emotional intent is also a part of kinesthetic and aural memory. If you have a passionate fortissimo climax, you're going to play that very differently than a phrase ending. And these different technical gestures must be part of the memorization because they are part of that kinesthetic memory. So don't memorize just the notes. So let's get down to how I memorize. And this is just what I've come up with years of experience. So let's learn small sections at a time, making a daily practice plan for progress, because you can get stuck on something that you're having trouble with. So learn sections, figure out how many days you're going to take to memorize this, and stick to your plan. Memorize in small chunks, 4 to 8 measures. I've even memorized 2-measure pieces because I was worried about a particularly difficult passage. And so I sometimes put them close together because when you make these memory chunks, they also stabilize your touch memory. So use the kinds of memory we talked about, kinesthetic, intellectual, visual, and aural, to help yourself memorize initially. So now I'll talk about how I do this all the time. And I have been memorizing this way for about 30 years. Tells you how old I am. So play each section or checkpoint. I call them checkpoints. I always have. I don't even know how I got the term. But you can call it your happy place if you want. But this is the place where you are going to start in your memorization. You pick your checkpoint, 4 to 8 measures long, and then you practice it enough times until it becomes in your short-term memory. So you're going to be, at first, practicing it with the music to make sure you're getting everything. Then you're going to be practicing without the music in front of you, doing it over and over, trying to get this into your short-term memory. You can think of the checkpoints as places where you can pick up and start at any given moment in a performance. They will help you recover if you have a memory lapse. They also keep you from having a memory lapse. If you think about memory as like going along on a train, and the train is here, and it gets to this piece of track, and you have a memory lapse, this track breaks. Once that track is broken, if you take the train and go back to the beginning and come along, you will go off the track in the same place because that kinesthetic memory is damaged there, and only some practice will fix it. Very experienced pianists could probably go back and play through that because of hours of practice, but a child will always do it. And you've probably seen it in your recitals where they have a memory lapse, they go back to the beginning and they have the same one again. So by having these pieces of train track that you've established using the checkpoints, you come along, you're at the broken track, you break, pick it up, put it on a new piece of track and go forward. So it's always unwise to go back because you have that kinesthetic break and you need to try to avoid it. If you do go back, you have to really focus on what you're doing to get through that damaged piece of track. So frequent repetitions of those checkpoints that you're creating as you do your memorization have to happen. The repetition is what's helping you make it from short-term to long-term. And it won't stay in long-term memory unless you keep reviewing those checkpoints and reestablishing the beginning of each piece of track. So the track must fit together, but it has to be a clear technical place where you can start. So you can learn several different checkpoints in a practice session. It's no problem, but save exact repetitions for a different day. So remember, students who have memory lapses in a sonata allegro form because of the change of key, that kind of memorization must be done after either the exposition or the recapitulation is already memorized. So you're trying to compare and contrast so that there's no confusion. So I always memorize from the back. You don't have to. It's just what I've always done. So I would always memorize the recapitulation first, and I would be clear of the transition that stays from one to one rather than tonic to dominant in the exposition. So you're making some part of the pattern learned well and learned first, and then you do the other thing that's similar. So we've got our checkpoints. We're learning maybe a couple of pages. Later that same practice session, you want to review the things that you just memorized, because remember, they are in very, very short-term memory, and you want to get them to longer and longer term memory. Then the following day, you have to review them again. If I can, I break up my practice to several different hours during the day. So I might memorize in my first hour of the day, review in my second hour, and review again in my third or fourth hours a day. So the next day I would do the same thing, trying to reinforce that short-term memory and get it into long-term memory. So when memorizing the small sections, memorize each hand separately so that the hands do not become too interdependent. I know we play hands together all the time, but it will make your memory stronger if you do that. And if there's some just glitch in one hand, often the other hand can keep playing if you have memorized well and hand separately first and then put it together. So when I have my checkpoint, I would memorize each hand separately and then put them together and work on my memory that way. I'm trying to make stronger kinesthetic memory at the beginning of each checkpoint. So when you're doing your memory, look very closely at the page. Memorize everything. So often my students just don't memorize dynamics and they'll say, oh, I don't have those yet. You just can't not have those yet. They have to be all the time. So everything on the page, articulation, dynamics, things your teacher has written in for you, right? Rubato, phrase shaping, all of that must be part of that initial memory. Oh, I need to point out, when you're making these checkpoints, it's imperative that you start with the correct finger. So you will always see in my music and the music of my students, the finger at the beginning of the checkpoint, because you're trying to use touch memory that you've already established, and you don't want to send your fingers the wrong message. So correct fingering always. All right, so now let me tell you some ways that I check my memory after I do that memorization. So I'm memorizing from the back, you can memorize from the front, but I check it in many ways. So my first one is I play each hand alone from memory using correct fingering. And remember, I memorize that way, so this is just a way to review, to make sure that everything is still strong. When you're doing that, you can also be doing technical problems. So if you are memorizing something before you're really solid technically, use your checkpoints to review your rhythms if you practice with rhythms. However you practice from the checkpoints so that you're making that touch memory at the beginning of the checkpoint even stronger. So play each part separately with the other hand. This is only possible in pieces that are not very difficult, right? But it tells you that your intellectual memory is very clear and you know exactly what the notes are. Play one hand on the keys and the other hand silently on your leg or on top of the fallboard. you can also try playing one hand aloud and the other hand silently on the keys. This disturbs your oral memory terribly and can help you focus then on the intellectual memory. So we're trying to have all the kinds of memory working all the time when we're playing, and they're kind of going in and out. So we want all of them to be strong, with kinesthetic being the strongest and intellectual memory being the next. These are the primaries kinds of memorization. So then go away from the piano and mentally play your piece. Try to develop a good memory of the printed page and memory of the patterns of the keyboard and the exact notes and harmonies being played. So for atonal music, this is even more important because you have much less a strong intellectual tonal memory to go from. And tonal memory just helps us a lot. You'll see in the examples I've chosen very simple tonal things so that you can see clearly what I like to do. So alternate playing one hand from memory and then the other. So while you're doing that, you want to be singing the part you're not playing. And I'll show you that in the pieces we're going to look at. Okay, use those checkpoints that we memorized with to review your memory, and use them often. They don't stay very stable unless you play them every couple of days. So practice playing the piece backwards using your checkpoint. Even if you memorized forwards, go back and review playing backwards because you want to start on the last checkpoint and then the second to the last, the third to the last, and you want to play forward. So we always, when we have these memory places, we want to connect them forward so that we have continuity into the next section. I felt really terrible. Years ago, I told a student about my checkpoints, and he called them stopping points. And it really kind of messed him up because he thought of them as places to stop rather than places to start. And so he didn't connect well, and it wasn't useful. So think of them as places to start and go forward, right? We want kinesthetic memory where we can pick up and start cleanly and move ahead. So after you play a checkpoint, play at least 2 checkpoints after the one you're working on so that we have this continuity between sections and phrases. If it's near the end of the piece, I might play 4 or 5 checkpoints and go to the end. It depends on the length of the piece. If you have a 15-page piece, you probably want to do it in chunks. You don't want to waste your time going to the end every time, right? 2 or 3 checkpoints after is enough to make sure that continuity is very strong. Then, even after you have had a piece memorized for several weeks, go back to the music and check. Make sure nothing's crept in. It just kills me when a student comes back and I say, well, when's the last time you looked? Well, I don't know, a month ago. And meanwhile, they have a wrong note now that they didn't used to have, but they just kind of forgot. They played it one day and it became in their oral memory that that was correct. So check to make sure things are okay. And as a teacher, tell your students to look at the score and make sure they're still correcting everything you wrote. Okay, so let's look at memorizing a simple piece. I'm going to break down for you now and show you how I actually do it. I've chosen on purpose a pretty easy piece. So I have included on the left my intellectual memory cues. This is what I'm talking to myself about. And I'm talking to myself when I'm memorizing. Telling myself intellectual cues, and I'm telling them out loud, so I have one more sort of oral reinforcement of what I know. So I don't need to say, oh, this is in C major out loud. I'm doing it to reinforce my intellectual cue for my memory. So I have C major, the form is A, B, and in each section there are 2 phrases. So we have a phrase A prime, B prime. If you look at the sections, let's look at the A section. I'm looking for things that will help my memory. And I can often talk a student through a piece using intellectual cueing and then play part of it from memory for them, even though I haven't played the piece. But my intellectual cueing was strong enough I can remember the checkpoint we're working on in their piece. So our first checkpoint up there at the top, that has the right-hand pattern that goes up stepwise a third, and then outlines the triad. And for me, I think it goes kind of around the triad. And it does that pattern 3 times, and then it shifts and starts on the G going to the C 3 times. I would also look at that pattern and look at that articulation. So we have this articulation. Then we have 3 times this. and we have what I'm calling a turnaround. And if you look at all 4 phrases in this piece, you will see that we have some kind of turnaround every single time. That's an important thing to remember in the memory. There's always a turnaround, and it always starts on G. Let's look at the second half now. That right-hand motive is a sequence. It starts the same as the motive in the first section, but it's stepwise and then a repeated note. Then it has another leg on the next key, and one more leg, and then a different turnaround. So I do this with my students in lessons, by the way, just going through this intellectual cueing and tearing it apart. How are you going to remember? What are you going to remember? Tell me your cue. So then let's look at the left hand. Very simple. Uses 3 notes, C, G, C. In the A first phrase, it's 8th notes. In the B first phrase, it's 8th notes. And then in the second phrase of each one, it becomes 16th notes. So you can see I chose a really simple piece so we could do this. And if you were here in person, we would all try to play this at the end, just using our intellectual cueing. So now let me show you how I would memorize. I told you I start from the back, always. So let's memorize just the last checkpoint. So for me, that is my first checkpoint because I memorize from the back. So I remember my cue. We're in C major, right? I'm not going to play this in G or D. I'm in C. My checkpoint starts on C, and it's a sequence with 3 legs that has stepwise motion and then a repeated note that resolves. So I'm going to play that last checkpoint. And I have my same turnaround. Remember, they all start on G, but this turnaround ends. So I'll do that one more time. And the turnaround, that ends. And then we'll do the left hand. So remember I said in my intellectual cueing, the left hand is either 8th notes or 16th notes. And since this is the second phrase in this section, it's the 16th notes. And you'll see I put a little retard in there because I'm trying to practice everything that I want to see. So now I would put your hands together. Then we'll do the next checkpoint. For a student, this would take more time, but this is a very simple piece. You will see. You could memorize this during this lecture and go play it. So now we're going to do the second checkpoint. The things that are different. The right-hand pattern stays the same, but the transition scale passage changes. So I'm remembering that in my intellectual cueing. This time it's piano. So I would memorize it piano. And then I would play the next checkpoint from me. Left hand, same thing. Memorize the hands separately. And while I'm playing the single hand, I am hearing the other hand in my internal audiation because that helps me with my memory. So then I would do that hands together. You can see if those little pink circles, those are my checkpoints. And I use circles for my checkpoints too. They're a mess, but I just write pencil circles in my thing. So looking at that, we're going to do the last 2 checkpoints now. I'm going to try to be careful with articulation. I'm going to do my phrase shaping. I'm going to do my dynamics, and I'm going to think about when the pattern changes. You'll notice I started the checkpoint on the pickup 8th note. I don't always. I like to have a really clean start, but since this one does it every time, I decided to put that checkpoint at that pickup. Often I use a phrase beginning, but in the middle of a technical passage, I might just get it right on the difficult part so that I know it's strong, and then maybe 1-2 measures before that. Okay, so let's do those last 2 checkpoints. Sorry. and so forth. So I'm memorizing the entire piece like this. Now, let me go and show you a little bit some of the ways that I do the review techniques to reinforce the memory. So we just memorized the whole piece, let's say, and now we're going to do one thing at a time for reinforcing. So now I'm going to play the A section. So if you remember, let's look at this A section. The A section, the right-hand motive outlines the triad. So I might just leave this on the screen while you do that. So I'm going to play now the right hand from memory. I should tell you that I'm also thinking about how many times this pattern plays. 3 times that pattern, 3 times this pattern, and then that turnaround that we have between each phrase. Okay, let me play the left hand. This is no problem, right? And then changes. And you'll notice that at the end of the second phrase in the A section, the 16th note stops and it goes back to the 8th note. And so that's important to remember at the end of that checkpoint that we have that change. Then you can also, in addition to playing each hand separately from memory, alternate hands. So now I'm going to alternate just playing one hand or the other, but playing the whole piece. So from the beginning I have. So this takes some thought and understanding of the structure of the piece. So while I'm doing something like that, playing one part and then taking it out and playing the other part, my brain is audiating the entire piece and I am hearing, so I don't get confused where I am. So when I'm playing the left hand part, I'm thinking so that I keep track of where I am. You don't want to just randomly be counting measures. That's not helpful, right? What we're trying to do is get aural memory, visual memory, kinesthetic memory, and intellectual memory, musical memory, all to come together. So I'm doing things that help reinforce that. So when I'm doing that one hand alone, I'm also doing the phrase shaping, the articulation, and the dynamics. So let me play the B section one hand alone. So if you don't audiate, this memory kind of exercise will be really hard for you. But if you audiate, it will be just fine. So let's look at what that next one is. Let's do now playing one hand silently on the fallboard, and we'll do silently on the keys as well. So playing on the fallboard is a little more difficult than playing it silently on the key. Playing silently on the key with one hand gives you some kinesthetic memory, so your fingers want to respond even though they're not making sound. So let's try with the fallboard first. Or you could do the other way. Let's do the B section now, ghosting or playing silently one hand. So I'm going to ghost the left hand first. Remember, we have a sequence here, third leg of the sequence. Turn around. Now the left hand. Second leg of the sequence. Third leg of the sequence. Cadence. So then play the checkpoints from the end of the piece, and I've talked about this. So I'm going to just play for you now that entire piece, but from the end, from my last checkpoint back, okay? So, and I do this with pieces of any length. It doesn't matter. They're 30, 40 pages. I do this. So let me just play this for you backwards. So review the intellectual cueing quickly. Last checkpoint. It has a sequence that has 3 legs. The pattern is up a third by steps, repeated note, resolution. Then it has the turnaround like they all have, and this turnaround is what I'm telling myself. This turnaround ends the piece, so it's got the cadence. Okay, the second checkpoint, same thing in the right hand, only the turnaround is different. Third checkpoint, the other pattern goes up a third and then revolves around the tonic triad for 3 times, and then does another pattern for 3 times and has the connector. And then the last checkpoint at the top of the piece has that same pattern, only with the 8th notes in the bass note, in the bass. Here we go. Last checkpoint. Okay, this is my second to last checkpoint, the beginning of the B section. Third checkpoint, this is the second one in the A section. And then from the beginning, with all 4 checkpoints, telling myself the intellectual cues. After I have this well memorized, I don't use all this intellectual cueing. This is when you're doing the memorization process. If you're having trouble, though, you might always want to have an intellectual cue at a particular checkpoint to help you remember what it was. So my cueing is not nearly so extensive after I've got it memorized. Okay, so here's the whole thing from the beginning. Second checkpoint. Turn around. Piano, different pattern. Third leg of the sequence. Second leg. Third leg. Transition. So I hope that helps you get an idea of how I work with this memory stuff. It's a way of memory that I've just developed with lots of time, and I use it always. So let's look now at something a little more complicated. So this is something that I'm playing. This is the Clementi Sonata in B minor. This is the very end of it, part of the coda. You can see that I'm going to use the same kind of intellectual cueing here. You can see my pink circles for the checkpoints. So my intellectual memory cues as I'm memorizing, it's B minor. And we want to know, in case some horrible thing happens right at the end of the piece, right? 15151 makes a nice ending to any piece. Just make sure that you know what your key is so that you know what to do. There's nothing more heartbreaking for me than a student having a memory lapse at the end and not being able to finish. So know the key. The basic harmonies of the entire section basically are tonic and dominant. It's just a long extended coda. So if in doubt, play tonic and dominant a few times. Then let's look at each checkpoint, how I think. So I'm pretty obsessed with breaking things down, and that's why I think my memory technique works pretty well and is pretty fast. So look at that last checkpoint with me on the last line. So we have B minor arpeggio. What I'm telling myself is B minor arpeggio, right? But we have contrary motion at the beginning, and then the left hand stays in a pattern, just tonic, dominant, tonic, over and over. Right hand comes down the arpeggio and outlines that arpeggio. Then the second to last chord, that's a full chord, and the last chord, those are octaves. And I'm telling myself that. So I would do that first hand separate. Full chord, octave. And then left hand. Full chord, octave. And then hands together. So you can see I do the exact same thing that I did with that very simple piece in my own playing. Let's look at the second checkpoint. So I'm talking to myself, giving myself intellectual cues to help me memorize. So the second checkpoint, look at that. It's a B minor chord, goes contrary motion. like the first checkpoint, only the left hand stops at the bottom, and then it alternates with the 5/7 chord. In the third measure, it's the same, and then the fourth measure, you can see the 5/7 chord jumps up an octave. So if I was going to do that, I would be telling myself B minor arpeggio, F sharp 7, B minor, F sharp 7 up an octave, and then we have the last checkpoint, which is the B minor. Okay, so left hand, contrary motion from the right hand, but doesn't complete the arpeggio, doesn't go back, right? So just down. So if we put them together, so let's look at the third checkpoint. So we have a C major chord. Left hand jumps up an octave. Right hand is in first inversion, goes down an octave from the beginning of the checkpoint. Then we have a 1/6/4 chord, or B over F sharp. I don't care how you think about it. And then an F sharp chord, and then F7. So you can see that this is not something that a young child's going to be able to do, playing or intellectually. You have to be able to bring the intellectual cueing up with the level of the piece, right? But it's very easy to do this if you think this way and teach memorization in this way from the beginning. So for me, theory and form are just huge in the process of memorization, and people that don't understand them never will have a really secure grasp of the memorization. Okay, so let's do that third checkpoint. So we have the C chord, left hand jumps up, right hand jumps down, the 1/6/4 chord, 5, 5/7, and this checkpoint, they went contrary between 1 and 5. 1, 5 up an octave, it's 5/7, not, but, and then, so if we went from there, full chord, octave. Then looking back one more. These are very simple checkpoints. I am just telling myself the harmonies. If you look at this, it looks very complicated, but look closely and it's very simple. So we're on the checkpoint with the sforzando G major chord. So it starts with a full chord in first inversion, but then look at that. That complicated passage work, if you break it down in the right hand, is just outlining this triad. And it's doing that by ornamenting it. And then it resolves to the G, like we would expect, right? So it's not very complicated as it looks. It's harder to play than it is to memorize because it's the same pattern. And the left hand just has an ostinato, right? So if we put that together, hands separate, we memorize this. Remember, we had a G arpeggio that's ornamented. And then we had the C major chord in that next one. Left hand was just ostinato. We don't even really have to think about it because it just repeats itself. So let's put that hands together. So remember, we had a G chord, and then we had the G major arpeggio ornamented, but going up on the primary notes of the arpeggio. And then C. And we would expect a C chord after the G, right? Because we have a secondary dominant function going on here. So we would expect that C chord, and we're grateful to have it, right? Because what we think. So then we have the C chord. Then we're back. 1/6/4, 5, 5/7, 1, 5, 1, 5, 1. So we'll do one more checkpoint, and then we're going to go on and talk about some other things. But I just want you to really understand how I think here. So let's look at that next one back. So we're in B minor here. And this also goes around the arpeggio, but it has a little twist at the beginning. It goes under, and then it goes up. So you have to remember that little twisting underneath. And I don't care how you remember it, but you need to tell yourself something that this is different. Goes under to the main note of the arpeggio, under to the main note, and then it goes up the arpeggio. Left hand Very easy again. Just does ostinato with those three notes. So we don't really have to think about the left hand very much. We just look at that ostinato, remember what that is. So slowly we would put that together. The G major, right, has a different ostinato, goes up the triad. C major, which is what we expect. Back to tonic. 1, 6, 4, 5, 7, 1, 5, 1, 5, 1. Full chord, octave. Okay, so I hope you understand now kind of how I memorize and how I use them. I should make it really clear that when I practice and I'm learning a piece, I use the same checkpoints. So by the time I go to memorize, I've played those checkpoints hundreds and hundreds of times so that my touch memory there is already strong. It always shocks me when I tell a student, well, why don't you start here? And they simply can't and have to start 8, 12, 20 measures back. That's because they're not breaking up their practice into chunks and developing touch memory that has strong, stable starting places throughout the piece. So let's talk about creating a time frame. I think that a lot of traumatic performances come from an insufficient preparation time. I have this rule and I never break it. I don't play in public anything from memory that I have not had memorized for a month. And I use that month to review my memory over and over with all the ways that I just told you about. Remember at the beginning, I said that I have performance anxiety. As I've gotten older, it's gotten better, of course, but it was something that I needed to do to make myself feel safer on the on stage, right? Our thing is to feel safe so that we can enjoy our performance and just show people the music we chose. So I strongly think, too, that when one of our students has a bad experience playing from memory, it's partly our fault. I have fought students and canceled recitals when I didn't think they were ready because I didn't want them to be humiliated. Sometimes it's not the right thing to do. It's hard for them, right? They get very angry. But one really humiliating experience can change them playing, right? It can make them stop playing. It can make them hate the piano. You know, if you have a 13-year-old that gets humiliated on stage, you've just lost that student. So big time frame, right? 4 weeks in advance, memorized, and then 4 weeks of just reviewing memory. Then practice performing the piece for non-threatening audiences first. I am always shocked when a student doesn't want to have a run through of their recital before the thing. And I said, well, do you want to make the debut on stage? It's not a safe thing. So run your entire thing. If it's a piece, you know, for a recital piece for a student, or if it's for you as a performer, run it for friends. Do it several times. You can find out what's going to go wrong. And if you play it several times and you find yourself having memory lapses in different places, you know your memory's not good. If you have memory lapses in one place, the same place all the time, you have a problem with how you memorized, and you probably need better intellectual cueing there and maybe checkpoints closer together to make it safe. So another thing that's really helpful, so the more important the performance is, the more important this is. Learn the piece several months ahead of time, memorize it, put it away, and then come back, rememorize, and then play. So if you're preparing for a huge recital that's really important, like a degree recital or, you know, Carnegie Hall or something, don't just memorize 4 weeks ahead and play. You need to memorize that the year before, put it away, come back, and do that again. So the more important the event, the farther out we need to plan. One of my students yesterday was shocked because I'm talking about his junior recital for next year. He said, wow, in no other field would we have to plan so far. And I said, I'm trying to think about your practice time and your memorization time to make sure that you're safe. So gradually increase the stress, right? Play for family at home. Play for studio class. Play a recital for your family. Play in a public recital. Then play in a low-level competition, and then play in a competitive competition or in an important recital. So if you're doing a doctoral recital next month, don't do the debut that day, please. It's a way to make you feel better is to play for people. Then let's talk about performance anxiety. Performance anxiety is caused by the fear that the performance won't be a success. I remember my sister once saying to me, "You are so dedicated." And I said, "Oh no, I have a strong fear of public humiliation." I'm dedicated as well, but you know, the thought of just losing it on stage is a pretty good practicing motivator. So if you've prepared your pieces well and memorized and tested your memory for at least 4 weeks in a careful, controlled way, you're probably going to be fine. Okay, if you haven't prepared well, then you have good reason to panic, and your performance anxiety is well-founded. And there's nothing that this lecture can do about that, right? Only better preparation can solve this kind of panic. So occasionally my students have this kind of performance anxiety, but they've gotten themselves into that situation, right? So we want to perform well by planning way in advance. Okay, forget yourself. Try to form the habit of just really focusing on the music when you're practicing, because if we don't focus when we're practicing, we're not going to focus when we play. So you can't have your phone up here, play a piece, and then check your text for a few minutes, and then play again, right? You have got to focus, focus, focus while you're practicing so that you develop that kind of focus that will get you through the performance under the stress of having an audience there. Then, while you're actually playing, focus on the kind of sound you want to produce. Listen to your phrasing. Think about the next phrase. How are you going to shape it? Where's the climax of that phrase? Try to avoid thinking about other things. It's when you think about something else that something's likely to happen. I've never had a memory lapse while I've been thinking about the music. Don't be self-critical. Negative self-talk is never, never helpful. I know it's hard to stop it, but as I've aged, I've gotten better at just not listening to that demon inside, right? No negative self-talk. And while you're doing the self-talk, you should remember that sometimes while you're talking to yourself, you have another memory lapse. And so then you have more things to talk about. So just no negative self-talk. Stay in the present. When I was young, I met this elderly woman who talked about the importance of staying in the present. And, you know, I loved her and I cared for her, but I didn't really get it. And then when she died 2 years later, I thought, okay, I should have stayed maybe in the presence a little more with her. But when you're playing, be there. Be in that measure, on that note, at that time. Anytime you're ahead of yourself or behind yourself, you're likely to have a memory lapse. Stay where you are. Don't worry about the memory lapse you just had. If you missed a note, it doesn't matter. We don't care. If you're worried about a passage that's coming up, don't worry about it because it doesn't help you to worry in advance. It will just make things unstable where you are. Feel friendly toward your audience. In general, they're there because they want to support you and they want you to do well, right? They feel just as uncomfortable as you do if you have a memory lapse. So they're on your side. And many times they're friends and family and they care about you and they do want you there. So be grateful that you can play the piano. Know that your playing is beautiful and has the power to touch somebody. We have an art that touches people in a different way than any other art. And you have to remember that nobody plays the piano like you do. Nobody. Even if I try to make my students be absolute replicas of me, which I don't, but they can't be. We are all absolutely unique. And that's your gift to the world. So, go with that gift and enjoy. So, thank you for attending my webinar. I hope it was helpful. I know memorization can be so traumatic, and I just wanted to share my thoughts about how to make it less traumatic. So I'm going to turn off my sharing now and try to remember how to look at your questions. So just thank you all for attending. I'm really happy to see you all here. Okay, first question. Let's see. Oh, sorry guys, I'm having a little trouble with navigating my scroll bar here. Okay, I think I have my first question. Forgive me if I missed one. Okay, do you restart the memorization process from day one, or do you work on getting notes in the fingers first? I work on getting the notes in my fingers first. And as I said, I practice from the things that will then be my checkpoints for memorization. So absolutely. After I have a piece really well learned, though, it may not be up to tempo. Say it's a very difficult piece and I'm still working on that, but I know all the notes, my fingering is good, I know what I'm doing, then I can start memorizing, and I use my checkpoints to do technical practice within the checkpoint. But so no, I don't start memorizing until I have everything in my fingers. Okay, do I teach from the back to the front? When students start a piece, do they work on the last section before trying to play any of the rest of the piece? No, I teach from the front. So I just teach the whole piece through. I make sure I hit all the sections. With my university students, they're playing long pieces, so I just make sure I'm hearing all the sections all the time. But I memorize from the back because of that thing with the checkpoints, needing continuity after the checkpoint. If you do your checkpoints from the front, I know some people can, but I don't like it because you don't have the checkpoint into the next section. And you are always trying to make this a starting point that goes forward. So that's why I do it from the back, but I teach just normally, just front to back. Okay, this is another one. I'm not an MTNA member. I'm an engineer who started studying piano at age 5 and has played from memory for many years. I was alerted to this webinar by MTNA members in my piano group. Is there a way to get a copy of the webinar and the PowerPoint? This is a great webinar. Oh, I thought it was a question, so I don't really need to answer. So my PowerPoint is in the MTNA webinar. So when you log on to watch, you can just see the PowerPoint. If you are not a member, you can just send me an email directly. On my PowerPoint, I had my email address. Also, I just teach at the University of Wyoming. If you pull up the University of Wyoming Department of Music, you'll see me there. Okay, memorization is very time-consuming. Why not use music if one is a good reader? This is such a thing, right? I would love to just use music all the time. I'm actually a really good sight reader, and I could play a whole lot more solo recitals if I used music. So as I've aged, occasionally I've played one solo recital with music now, but I just feel so mixed about it. I actually do play better when I play from memory because it means I've spent a lot of time with the music. And I guess I want to commit that time to really owning the music, but I'm not opposed to people playing with music. You know, it's why I do a lot of collaborative piano, and so I can probably play one solo recital in the time it takes me to play 10 collaborative piano recitals. So yes, it is time consuming, but I just like that feeling of being totally immersed in the music. And, you know, I teach at a university, we require it of the pianists, but as usual, you know, we don't require it of any other instrument except piano. So let me go to the next question here. Oh, here's a question that just didn't get tagged. About my intellectual cues, I write some of them down. With my college students, I don't need to so much, but if it was a student, I would. I would have some of those intellectual cues already in their score, right? I would write the key at the top of the piece. I would write the form. I write that in all their music. And I would have already talked about what key they're in and what chord that is right there. So yes, I write them kind of as they're learning the piece. So remember, I'm using the way I learn is by chunks anyway, and the way I think is by using theory and knowledge of form to help. So all the time I kind of do that. Okay, here's another one. Oh yes, this question is, do I ever have the student start from the hardest part of the piece or start from the middle or the B section? Yes, it just depends on the piece. So I have had students who I wasn't sure if they could play something. Like I had a student that wanted to play the first Chopin ballade, and you know the coda is very difficult. And so I had him start at the coda, and I figured if he could play the coda, he can play the piece. So yes, I do that. And then I actually sometimes do my checkpoints starting at a difficult part of the piece as well. I memorize it first because I'm trying to get it memorized, and then I practice from memory, rechecking the score. Your questions are great. Thank you so much. Okay, I know fingering is important from the start. When do you incorporate gesture as part of the learning and memorization process? I incorporate gesture from the beginning. So as they're learning it, because I think technical problems are all caught up in the gesture. So I'm working on it every lesson. So I don't add gesture later because I think it's part of the entire thing. But that's a really great question. Thank you for asking that. Oh, so this is a question I teach a lot of young students. It's 1 to 2 pages. Do you recommend this method for them? Absolutely. Start it young. It gets very easy for them, and then they grow up not being afraid to play from memory. So you can do a checkpoint kind of system for an 8-measure piece. It's probably 2 4-measure phrases. You have them learn each phrase, and you talk about the intellectual cueing, which could be as simple as you have a C in the right hand and you have a C in the left hand, and then you play that 5-finger pattern. But you talk them through it in the same way, at the same intellectual level where their understanding is currently. Okay, I have a 16-year-old intermediate student who struggles with regular practice habits and has serious performance anxiety. He's had several difficult performances, some before he came to me as a transfer student. What advice could you give on how I could talk with him about his anxiety? I will use the points you've given him to work with the upcoming December performance. Thanks. This is a good question, right? This comes up all the time. I think the thing you need to talk to this student about is he's had bad performance experiences because he wasn't prepared. You know, I made that 4-week rule for myself for a reason. I just didn't want to have the possibility of being humiliated in public because it's so hard to get over it, right? So I think talk to him about that. Does he want to play well? And if he does, then this is what he's got to do. And he's got to get the piece memorized 4 weeks ahead. He can still work on increasing the speed or technical problems from memory, from those checkpoints. It will actually help make that touch memory at the beginning of each checkpoint very strong. So yeah, this is very typical, this transfer student you have, but I would just be very honest. You can talk to my students. I'm very straightforward and direct because what I want is for them to play better. I don't necessarily think my job is to make them feel good. My job is to make them play better, and playing better makes them feel good. Okay, with young ones or even more advanced, do you ever play pieces like duets from memory? Teacher plays one part while student plays another and then switch. Oh, I've never done that. That's very interesting. Wow. No, that's a great question, but I've never done that. Okay, do you give a timetable for learning memorizing to students? Yes, I do. So I ask them to do the same kind of schedule I would do. It's very difficult to corral college students and make them do what you want them to do, but with my younger students, I can make them, right? So yes, I think it's really important to look ahead. I often will look through the whole piece and make a schedule just for learning it, and then make a schedule for the memorization as well. Okay, I think that's all my questions. I hope I didn't miss any right at the bottom, so I'm going to just scroll down and just check. Okay. Oh, no, there were some more. Okay, so I'm going to go down so I don't miss it. Will there be a handout to print with memorization ideas? No, but if you send me an email, I could send you that, okay? Then, how would this be adapted for single-line instruments? Same way. So you're going to do the same kind of intellectual cueing for form and for the harmonies. That part is the same. And then you might have, like with a string player, you might have them do the bowing just on an open note, or you might have them do the fingering separately. But you're still trying to develop kinesthetic memory, and so it's really important to do that left-hand fingering at the beginning of each checkpoint. So, and to have checkpoints playing each one strongly. The idea of the checkpoints is that you have new touch memory at various places through the piece that you can then use. Okay, just make sure I haven't missed any more. I'm sorry for those I missed. Great, I think I have everybody now. I wanted to say thank you so much for attending my webinar. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I hope it was helpful, and I hope that if you've had memory trauma yourself, that you can find this as a way to make life easier. All right, take care.